So, good morning. This is Scott Young from Optrics Engineering, and this is another edition of the Optrics Insider. With me, of course, I have Sean Stribber, your Technical Services Manager. So, good morning, Sean.
Good morning, Scott.
So, the three topics we're going to talk about today is a thin client management software with a backdoor. So, if you use thin clients, that's worth knowing about. Next is if you're infected with ransomware, it sounds like you might be fined if you pay the ransom, which is kind of interesting. And then finally, UEFI malware. So let's start talking about thin clients. So first off, maybe describe for people who don't know, what is a thin client and what is the thin client management software backdoor that you found?
Okay, I didn't find it, but thin clients are really mini computers that just have enough horsepower to create a remote connection into a full desktop of some sort, usually running on a virtualized infrastructure. So the thin client would be connected to the keyboard, monitor, and mouse that's sitting physically in front of the person, but there's not enough computing power to install Office, and in fact, they typically don't even run Windows as an operating system. They run a customized version of something.
Right.
So you sit down at your computer, you log into your thin client, and really it's a window onto a much more powerful system elsewhere, usually in IT office or a server room. So the thin client management software is, of course, because we have all of these computers out there, they need to be updated and taken care of and configured. So that's what this software does.
Excellent. Okay. And so what's the backdoor that has been found?
Well, in this case, it's the HP Device Manager software. Again, it's the software to manage all of the thin clients sitting on the physical desks, and it was found that it had hard-coded backdoor credentials, a way to easily, if somebody had access to the software, gain access to all of the thin clients, reconfigure them. You try and log in with your username and password in what you think is your typical desktop, but in reality, it's been redirected elsewhere.
Interesting. So, what kind of organizations, or what's the scenario where an organization would want to use a thin client?
Thin clients are perfect for any organization which has a lot of people doing the same thing, a lot of data entry, a lot of call centers, any place where they've got hundreds of people that are doing the same job, and they can leverage the being able to manage and maintain the software on a central location.
So, okay, now I suppose with a lot of people working from home now, it's possible that if your organization gave you a computer, especially if the form factor is really small, and they're saying just use this to remote into the office, then it's possible that they're using a thin client.
Very possible, yes.
And how about ATMs? Do they use a thin client?
No, they've got a lot more hardware, so they're typically full computers inside them.
Okay, just curious. Cool. Okay, so if your organization uses a thin client, especially HP, certainly keep an eye out for that. Is there a patch for that to fix it?
There was a patch supplied or made available by HP.
Okay, so make sure you run that patch if you're using HP to manage your thin clients. Okay, so let's next move on to ransomware. So if you're infected with ransomware, it sounds like you might be fined if you pay it.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. So ransomware, they lock up your computers or your programs and your data files, and both A, have it encrypted, and B, threaten to release unencrypted copies of it if you don't pay the ransom.
Right.
Well, some of the organizations behind the ransomware are in countries that the US government has sanctions against.
Right.
So if you are paying them, the ransomware authors, for unencrypting your files, you are having a financial transaction with a company or an organization that the US government doesn't want you to deal with, that has provided sanctions. And they're even saying that even if you're not the one paying the actual fine or the fee, but you are somehow felicitating it, so you are negotiating with the ransomware people and saying, hey, yeah, they will pay the ransom, they just don't want to pay this hefty of a sum. What kind of a discount can we get? We'll pay it right quick, follow your instructions. Even those persons, because they are in the middle of the transaction, they could be fined. So
So it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of scenario.
Yeah,
That's it. That's interesting because also a lot of insurance policies have a cybersecurity aspect to it that would pay for if you have to pay for a fine. So now even if you trigger that part of your policy to pay a fine to a bad actor to get your data back, then I guess that doesn't really help either.
yeah,
So I guess the solution to this one is make sure you've got good backups so that you can roll back to a good backup prior to getting infected, so that you have a route around that. And then the other reason or thing you can do is to make sure your staff aren't being socially engineered and clicking on phishing emails to bring that ransomware attack into your environment in the first
correct.
place.
And you wouldn't know where the ransomware people are that have encrypted your desktop. All you know is they've got a Bitcoin address that they want you to send money to.
Right.
But a lot of the brokers have figured out that, ransomware XYZ is from this particular area of the world and thus would be on that sanction list. So they won't even deal with them anymore.
Right.
So instead of spending a lot of money on that insurance, take that money and apply it to making your environment more secure. Training for the end user, for the staff, and better defenses at the edge.
Well, ultimately, yeah, the insurance policies will be whatever you negotiate with your broker, but interesting. So let's finish off with UEFI malware. So first off, what is UEFI?
UEFI stands for Unified Extensible Framework Interface. Basically, when you buy a computer or a motherboard, sorry, and it's not have an operating system installed, it still has a very minimal operating system. Now, it used to be called BIOS, Basic Input Output System. It was just enough smarts and brains to get started and go out and find an operating system and load it. Well, UEFI came along as a better standard for that, and it really is a little mini operating system unto itself. It's got network card drivers, it's got interfaces. It started out with on the server side of things, but is now on all the desktops that have been released in the last number of years. And the thing about it is that it is an operating system. So it can do a lot of things. You can get into it as part of the boot up process. And it has its own set of vulnerabilities. So what's happened is the malware writers have figured out that, hey, instead of infecting the Windows operating system, if we can infect that mini operating system in behind the scenes that runs everything else, even if they reformat and reinstall Windows, because this UEFI operating system lives on a physical chip on the computer, it won't get wiped out.
So it sounds like okay. So is this something that you can flash the chip?
Yeah, when you do a BIOS update or a firmware update on your motherboard, this is effectively what you're doing is you're updating the UEFI firmware.
Gotcha. So it's not one of those things like in some cases, some of these at that level, my understanding is that the virus is so insidious, you can't get rid of it. So the only way you can do it is physically replacing that hardware.
Yeah, correct.
Interesting. Wow.
Or go back to the manufacturer and they might have a way of doing it, of
Right.
putting a brand new, fresh copy of the UEFI firmware on that motherboard.
Wow. It's a never-ending thing, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
So there are some tools out there that will allow you to keep that up to date because it is an operating system. It's going to have flaws and problems in it. So definitely want to keep that up to date as much as possible too.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, so to recap, if you're using if your organization is running thin clients and you use the HP management software, make sure you update to the latest version to remove the backdoor. Also, just I'm not sure what to say about the the ransomware infection. If you're paying, if you've been hit by the ransomware and you're considering paying the fine, uh,
Paying the
well,
ransom and then pay the fine on
right,
top of it. Yeah.
yeah. Wow, that's a tough situation. Just hope you don't get in that situation in the first place and have good backups. And then finally, so with the UEFI malware, how would you know that you have it?
Very hard. The UEFI malware is probably nation state type malware. It's infected possibly via phishing email or even possibly by a supply chain infection where somebody has physically unpacked the motherboard, flashed their malware onto it, and then packed it back up and shipped it off to the manufacturer,
Right,
or so very, very hard to find it. You might not be able to find it by looking at the computer itself, but you might be able to find the uh, indicators of compromise by watching the traffic. The malware's on there for a reason.
right.
It's trying to get data out, or it's trying to allow people in. It's making connections that you haven't authorized.
So yeah, so I guess if you have a NetFlow analyzer and you're watching the traffic and it's spiking, and you
Mm-hmm.
just don't understand that, that could be an indicator. Um, Certainly, one thing they could be using your computers is for cryptojacking, but perhaps that's a conversation for
Another.
another one. But wow, so I guess updates is the best thing you can do.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Okay. Well, thanks for that, Sean. Anything else you'd like to say?
No, it's just, yes, as they used to say in the Oilers hockey, skate with your head up.
That's right. Exactly. Okay. Well, thanks, Sean. Thanks, everyone. Of course, if you enjoyed the topics today, please like, share, and subscribe to this video, or whichever way you've watched it, and certainly leave a comment below. Thanks, Sean. Have a great
Okay.
week, everyone.